Hello and welcome to another article from the Academy of Historical Fencing. In this article I'm going to be working from a request that was for the tips of steel swords, and essentially the different types of tips that are used in sparring swords, what I think of them and what we recommend. It's a useful subject to look into. It's something that's had a bit of controversy and a lot of discussion over quite a few years now, and I'm going to give you an overview of the different tips that exist and what we use in the club and what we recommend. So the first thing is the default option of just a blunted tip. This is what we would call baited or rebated, or just a blunted tip, which is exactly as it sounds. It is just a blunted tip, and in fact this is an original cavalry sabre that has been blunted for training practice, as they often were. For quite a few years a lot of us trained like this with just blunted steel tips, even though perhaps people should have known better. The reality is that even quite a broad blade, a broad tip like this, can penetrate certain areas. In a fencing jacket it's not likely to go through, but things like areas of the hand and the gloves, and if it slips into parts of the legs that aren't necessarily as well protected as say a fencing jacket would give, it can cause issue and it can penetrate. I've actually seen at events long swords such as the Albion Lecternau's, which is quite a broad tip, at least as broad as that, go into somebody's hand and out the other side. I've seen quite a few blades actually penetrate where you really don't want them to. So the first thing is, you do need tips. It's very rare you'll see a video of ours without any kind of tip on, anytime recently anyway. Perhaps the only exception is my basket hilt, because I restrain from using any thrust work when I've actually got no tip on it. Even then, I'd recommend you put a tip on it. Even if you're not specifically thrusting, there are scenarios where people can run onto blades, or during certain cutting actions, the point can end up getting snagged or engaged. So you do need to tip the weapons. It can be damn dangerous to not tip them. You'd be amazed what a blunt tip can actually penetrate, and again, particularly to the areas of the hands, into the thin parts of the jacket like the armpit, or if it went into, slipped under a bib or something like that, it could be quite dangerous. So you really do want some kind of tip beyond just rebated or baited. What different options are there? The first thing is what we saw with Hamway a few years ago with the practical rapiers, is what you'd call a button tip or a nail head, which is a historical solution, and it's as it sounds. It's the head of a nail effectively, so you just got a flat top to the blade which provides a lot of protection against any kind of penetration. Now, I haven't got one here because I don't have any of those Hamway blades anymore. I have had them over the years. They are good in that they will stop penetration. So from the perspective of actually penetrating with a thrust, they are safe. The only issue with them really is that because it's the nail shape, the edges of that nail head tend to snag on jackets, so they can rip jackets and rip equipment and snag in other weapons and things like that in ways that are really not desirable. So overall, they are quite safe. They're solid to use, but I'd recommend a little bit of tape or something, or another tip over the top, just to stop them snagging on your gear and causing damage to your fencing equipment. So that's the nail head, or button tip, which works quite well. The next option, which is probably very common still today, is what Darkwood Armoury produce, which essentially is a rubber archery blunt, effectively, that's been designed more for a short sword blade. And you can see this one's gone through the tip. I don't use these anymore, and I absolutely would not recommend them. We did use them for a few years, and I can understand why you'd want to use rubber. You think of the shock absorption of it, it's ideal. The reality is this happens far more than you would like it to. When the tips do go through, you'll often find it going through a lot further than this. They'll just snap in half or go much further down the blade, and then you're ending up with, again, a very fine tip on the end, which is quite dangerous. And we were finding, if you're using rapiers at quite high contact levels, which with these you can because they're quite flexible, we were going through perhaps a tip every month on one of these rapiers, which means there's quite a good chance of that puncturing through and becoming dangerous. And it's all very well to say, well, you can check the rubber tip before each fight, but you never know when it's going to go through. And it also can get expensive. I can't remember what they cost now, but I think for us in the UK they kind of work out about £1 a piece. So you throw in tips all the time at these rapiers, and it can get a bit frustrating, constantly changing them. But yes, I think it's a bit unsafe, so I don't recommend the rubber tips. They were a good stopgap approach, but they don't work as well as you'd want them to, and I don't consider them safe enough to use, particularly for rapiers. The only time I've seen rubber tips work particularly well on swords is when people have got something on a long sword, like an Albion, that's like what you'd have on the bottom of a walking stick and is really quite substantial, which I don't think is a good idea. From a safety perspective, yes it is, but it's so bulbous and so huge, it snags in everything and it's just really frustrating. So don't really use the big rubber tips, I would say. On to the next solution, which is something we saw coming in very popular, particularly from some of the Polish smiths and Peter Regeni in Hungary, is this, the folded tip, which is, we have found to be absolutely exceptional. So it is just as it looks. The tip is folded over on itself, which means you've got nothing actually added onto the blades, nothing that's going to sort of snag or get ripped off, because that's another problem with the rubber blunts, is that even with gaffer tape on or duct tape, they can get snagged and rip themselves off when other blades encounter them during some winding practices and things like that. Whereas the folded tip tends to snag far, far less. Now, have we had any problems with this whatsoever? Well, the only time I can say at all that we've had an issue with this is one of our fencers managed to end up cutting it in half here. The most unusual of hits, I would say, and it's the only time I've ever seen it happen, and that was a Regeni blade, and he did replace it very, very quickly, actually. So that's the only time I've ever seen an issue, and that was just a one-off. So the folded tip works incredibly well. It doesn't need anything else on top. Will it hit a little bit harder than a rubber tip? Yeah, of course it will. But, and this is a sabre, so we're doing realistically a lot less thrust work than you would with a rapier anyway. I think the folded tip works really well. I know some people don't like them, they'd rather have just a blunted blade like my original down there, and yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I'd like my swords to look as original as possible, but at the same time, I think this folded tip is the ideal solution, particularly for a sabre or a longsword. See the same with longsword feathers. It's the ideal solution for safety, practicality. It's quite slimline as well. It doesn't get snagged up and cause sort of problems with blade snagging, because blades slide up on the rubber tips and other tips and they snag on them, for example. So I think the rolled tip is absolutely exceptional for most types of swords. And even for rapiers, it'll be pretty damn good. Regeni fits these on rapiers as well. I got no problem with that, that's pretty good. But you still might want something else on top, which I'm going to go on to in a bit. So that's the rolled tip. Next would be what we would call a flared or sort of fluted tip, which is, as you see on this Danelli dagger. And I'm pretty sure Danelli does all of his blades like this. All the ones I've seen certainly have been. And all it is that the blade actually does flare out into quite a broad tip. Now, in the past, I've seen some sword manufacturers do this, and it's ended up having almost a sort of a weighted effect on the tip, which is unfortunate for the handling, and potentially is going to hit a little bit harder at the tip. But the Danelli one is really quite slimline, and I found no problem with it whatsoever. So all the Danelli blades that we've got in the club, we've got a few rapiers, a few daggers, a few long swords. They've all got this flared tip, and it works incredibly well. That being said, we do still tip over the top of these Danellis. Not the daggers, because again you're using them for a lot less for actual thrusting work. But over the rapiers, which are constantly going to be hitting people on the thrusts, we do tip those, just for the perspective of getting a broader tip still. Now you might wonder, well, what's the point in having a flared tip if you're going to tip over the top of it? Well, think back to what I said about the darkwood rubber tips. If they were flared, and you had rubber or something on top, and the tip was ripped off, you would still have a broad tip like this, which although might still hit a bit harder than a broader tip, it will be safe and not penetrate your jacket, or your gloves for that matter. So I think the flared tip is an excellent idea, and it's particularly well suited to rapiers and daggers, which is I think why Danelli uses it an awful lot, and it's really successful. So on to what we would recommend for tipping rapiers, and also what we would tip our Danellis with, is bullet casings. Brass bullet casings, we usually use something like 44 Magnum or 357 Magnum, something like that. They nice long cartridges, but thin enough to get over the rapier tips without being bulbous. It may seem like an odd solution, but what we found over the years is it's the one thing that is guaranteed not to actually get pierced by the tip of the weapon itself, is it's nice and strong. Will it hit a little bit harder than a darkwood rubber tip, for example? Maybe, marginally. I'm sure it's sort of going to have an effect, but it's quite modest. We've been using bullet casings now for, I don't know, maybe 5 years at least, and it's very successful. And this bullet casing, for example, has been in use all that time. They don't really ever wear out. I think you probably go 10, 20 years on a bullet casing like this at least. So you get the very minor wear on the edge. They don't go sharp. It's a nice broad surface area to actually strike somebody with. It works really quite well. And it's a bit more slimline than the rubber tip as well, so it's ideal. And we put these bullet casings, this is actually a Denelli basic rapier, so we put them on the Denellis over the top of the fluted tips, which I think is the ideal solution. So you've got a nice tip for actually hitting our opponent with, that's safe, and then if it did for any reason get torn off, you can see the gaffer here has become a little bit weak and it could be prone to actually breaking. If it did come off, you've still got the flared tip, like the dagger that I showed you, underneath, which will still be safe enough. So I think that's the best solution. Denelli, I think he's really nailed it there. Flared tips, but I would still recommend the bullet casings on the actual tip of the flared tip. Okay, so I think that takes us to all of the different options on tipping steel swords. So if you look at our club and what we do, we tip all of our rapiers with bullet casings, no matter what they are. So whether they're Darkwoods or Denellis or Regenis, we tip them all, and the Hamways as well. Bullet casing on the end, and tape over to hold it on. And for our long swords, sort of fetish verts, and our sabres, we used rolled tips, as is very common with Regeni and quite a few other swordsmiths as well. So that's it. That's tips for you. Thanks for watching.